Listeners and subscribers, hope all is well. Also, hope to get through this without too many interruptions. The neighborhood has been loud and busy today. But anyway, since the North Korea summit is approaching, I've thought about addressing it here on the channel again, but briefly. Officially, the summit is offering an opportunity to reduce the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons, which carry substantial risk, particularly because it wasn't preceded by months of lower-level diplomatic preparation. That was one of the initial concerns allies and others had with what some called Trump's hasty agreement to meet. Trump, after consulting his circles, began to rethink his strategy, citing the potential of political embarrassment if we were stood up, essentially. Now that led to the summit's cancellation, postponement, and eventual reinstatement. Proclamations made by a North Korean official regarding Vice President Pence was the catalyst. They were perceived as offensive. However, even so, upon mounting political, national, and international pressure, as you know, the decision was made to follow through with the summit. While some adhere to the idea that this is a mistake for the United States, many assert these actions aren't consistent with a loose cannon necessarily, but someone operating more tactfully, with course corrections dictated from the upper echelons of control, of course. As a side note, we should probably start paying attention to those who have the power to institute those course corrections, the puppet masters, if you will. But that's really all I'd like to cover for now on the summit, since I did a previous video touching on the more profound implications on the other side of this. I will of course come back if anything else major comes up. So, changing gears, I did want to come back to something from an earlier episode though. If you keep your head above the waters of distraction, then you know there's nefarious agenda being pushed through California disguised as altruistic policies and legislation. The reason this is so concerning for others outside of California is because the U.S. has been attempting to conform other states to the California standard. This basically means California is being positioned as a role model state. If you haven't heard of something called the California effect, I advise you do some digging. In part, increasingly more companies and manufacturers ensure the complicity of their products to California standards, essentially because if it's up to code in the Golden State, it's typically up to code elsewhere. Now that doesn't sound like a bad strategy, but apply this rationale to politics. While it's not a perfect comparison, it points to how other states may be impacted in the future. In fact, we're already seeing other states beginning to falter. The outmigration or exodus of Californians is beginning to shape the politics of neighboring states. Those who leave, who aren't non-voters, conservatives, or liberals fed up with the laws their fellow liberals enacted, tend to vote for the same things that caused them to leave in the first place. You know, an elementary issue is society's desensitization to collateral damage. Entirely focusing on laws we hope will discourage certain conduct often foments failure when considering the dragnet of collateral damage that ensnares law-abiding citizens. Perhaps this isn't a perfect analogy either, but you've probably heard it before. The analogy of the speed bump. The speed bump exists to deter the actions of substandard drivers, however punishes and disciplines all current and future drivers while doing so. This roughly highlights the processes we've succumbed to. Now, some may disagree, some may get offended, and that's fine, at least for now, because if you've noticed, not only are more people getting easily offended, but more powerful people to boot. I think the implications there speak for themselves. But don't get me wrong here, while the left is often an obvious and easy target for ridicule when it comes to legislation, the right isn't without its flaws. Wrestling against peaceful protest, a right our servicemen and women fought and died for, gnashing teeth at Starbucks over non-Christian themed cups, having a stink over a comedic roast of the White House press secretary, and criminalizing aspects of public outcry are just a few conservative debacles. However, if we're to be perfectly honest, the left and right are both guilty of unwarranted bumps in the road. Actually, many would argue that paradigm is awash with inherent flaws and fundamental issues. What's worse, often those belonging to either party rarely address, let alone admit it. It seems it's easier to fall for the trap of tribalism than it is to do otherwise. No doubts there's important changes that can be facilitated within the system, but with the constant hostility, we negate a lot in the process. Both the left and the right have collective and individual identities. We should shy away from forcing a group identity. It might be better to derive identification based on the apparent values rather than perceived values attached with an associated leaning. Notwithstanding misrepresentation, you wouldn't want to be placed outside of reasonable, sensible, moderate camps, depending on who you are. Now, it's obvious there are far excessive and extreme wings, but that's virtually all that's highlighted, especially within the media. The fact is, reasonable, sensible, moderate camps do exist within both wings, but the numbers are shrinking. Really, at the end of the day, it's important to denote the distinction of what's useful versus what's pathological and dangerous on both sides. It's also important to overcome the immense failings of preferring to be right versus being effective. Now, that's not to say both can't be effective, but I've been itching to jump back to something. My pseudo-series, Bye Bye California. Now, perhaps we'll get ourselves in a little trouble with this next part, but the truth is, California is imploding. Sure, we have Silicon Valley, Hollywood, we're in the top 5 largest economies of the world, and besides devastating fires, the weather is good. It's great if you're rich and not bad if you have some network or support group, but let's cite some concerns. Forced solar, compulsory vaccines, bag fees and bans, lower penalties for knowingly transmitting sexual disease, safe injection sites, sanctuary state policies, soaring cost of living, growing homelessness, exorbitant taxation, that's tobacco, gas, everything, political unaccountability, increase in crime and violence, highest poverty in the nation, exodus of the middle class, failing pensions, dead last rating in terms of quality of life, we could go on. The latest kicker on my radar, obligatory water rationing. And to that, for those who missed it, before we close, I thought I'd share something special in today's episode. As you probably know, I live in California, and shortly after hearing about some of the laws being passed here, my wife and I had a laugh, a big chuckle, which was after a huge sigh of frustration. Out of the skunkworks of California legislation was birthed a bill that's essentially tantamount to permanent water rationing. Details below. Now, its full enforcement isn't until 2022. However, in response and open protest to this gradual encroachment on our rights and freedoms, I thought I'd post this. I hope all is well. I hope you can hear me over the sound of this rushing water. So, California is known for pushing some pretty extreme agendas, at least ones that infringe on the freedoms and rights of the people in terms of policy, legislation, and laws. I decided what better time to get my pool back up and running than now, after just hearing about what California plans on doing with water rationing. Now, if you want to check out the particulars, I will leave links in the description below. But if you guys are worried about water and weather, if we fought back against these geoengineering campaigns, right? Against these stratospheric aerosol injections, solar radiation management, you wouldn't have, you probably would, but you wouldn't have as many people trying to pass laws that infringe upon your rights and freedoms. I'm sorry, and I'm just not a person who's going to let the government tell me how many toilet flushes I have. I'm not going to let them force me to choose between taking a shower and washing my dirty laundry. You know, there's proposals to institute low-flow toilets into homes. I mean, I don't know if you've ever used a low-flow toilet, but those things can hardly flush the water that's in them, let alone company, if you catch my drift. So, while California's trying to stick it to the people, and there are plenty of people in California that endorse this kind of infringement, I said, I think I'm going to fill up my pool. It had been green just for a little while, about 2 months or so, and I said I'm going to revive my backyard. I started with clearing up some of the foliage, cutting some plants down, getting ready to haul this stuff away, getting ready to replace this tattered fabric that the winter season didn't do too kindly. There's just high winds, and we're going to be doing some barbecuing, you know. Hopefully no infringements from Barbecue Becky, but she does have an invite. But anyway, just check this out, you know? There they go, laying some lines down. And it's not uncommon for this area to have 4, 5, even 6 of these aerosol injections overhead at any given time, and then spreading and fanning out. But anyway, what happened was we had a leak, so we did a drain and fill, some fixing here. Problem's being solved, and we're gonna have a pool again.
much to the dismay of California voters.
Now, I know to many California is synonymous with liberal, so let me be clear and say I'm not attacking one side, nor am I defending another. Also, I don't consume or talk politics as a practitioner, but more as an observer, a researcher. There are those who completely ignore politics, but to not understand how you're impacted would be rather short-sighted. At the end of the day, I don't believe things should always boil down to liberal versus conservative arguments or that strictly political approaches are constructive. Maybe I'm not really sure what to think, but perhaps this is a fair point. If the rest of the country did what was fruitful for the people and not solely their party, we might have had a different conversation today. What do you think? Take care out there.